out the red carpet for Japan. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida feted with a speech before a joint session of Congress and a White House state dinner. Like the Germans in Europe, the Japanese have had to shed a post-war pacifism that's even embedded in their constitution. And it's with an eye to China, North Korea, and Russia that they've drawn closer to South Korea and supported Ukraine. This Thursday, enter another former World War II foe of the Japanese, the Philippines, whose new president's invited for an unprecedented three-way summit. Their common cause is the territorial disputes in the South China Sea and a rivalry with Beijing that continues to intensify. What does Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and the nationalist Kishida have in common? How strong in Indo-Pacific alliance? Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about Japan at the heart of a blossoming alliance. And joining us, Jean-Yves Collin of the Asia Center think tank.
Good evening.
Thanks as well from Washington, Elizabeth LaRousse, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. Good to see you.
Yes.
Your reactions on the hashtag F24debate. It was a star-studded state dinner, an exchange of gifts, and Joe Biden his announcement that a Japanese astronaut will become the first non-American to visit the moon. But it was the speech this Thursday before the joint session of Congress that grabbed the headline. After fondly evoking his short spell as a child living in Queens, Fumio Kishida made the pitch for American leadership on the global stage, connecting the dots between conflicts.
As I often say, Ukraine of today may be East Asia of tomorrow.
So we heard Fumio Kishida, who also said that today's Ukraine could be tomorrow's East Asia. Joining us is correspondent Fraser Jackson at the White House. Fraser, the Japanese Prime Minister making a pitch for American leadership, and the Republicans seem to refrain from applause at those moments.
During the Prime Minister's address, at one point there was a moment where he mentioned Ukraine and said that, as you said, the Ukraine of today is the East Asia of tomorrow. That got a standing ovation from the Democrats, but didn't get much reaction from the Republicans, especially notably Mike Johnson, who was sat directly behind the Prime Minister, the man who is responsible for bringing the Ukraine aid bill, which is currently suspended in the House, to the House floor, something he has yet to do. However, there was a moment just a few minutes later where Kishida asked how long Ukraine could stand without U.S. help and said that Japan was there with the U.S. to help Ukraine. And that got a big ovation from the Republicans. So it was a bit of a mixed message. There was also a slight jab in that message from the Prime Minister, who said Japan was supporting Ukraine despite it being on the other side of the world. That is one of the things that we've heard from House Republicans, that they need to focus more on home affairs rather than what's happening in Europe. But of course, the message from the Democrats and indeed some Republicans in the Senate and also a few in the House is that what happens there also happens here. So it has been an interesting mix there between the reactions from the Republicans towards the Prime Minister in Congress.
Fraser Jackson, many thanks. Elizabeth LaRousse, did you get the sense, listening to that speech before the joint session of Congress, that this was a plea rather than a pitch for the U.S. to remain engaged on the world stage?
I think Japan is quite concerned about U.S. resolve around the world. You know, certainly the U.S. and Japan's security alliance is very tight, as it is with South Korea and the Philippines. But, you know, Japan, it's not lost on Japan that the United States is really lacking in shipbuilding. We're lacking in shipbuilders. We are also lacking in people to put on ships. And so being a maritime nation that Japan is, and with the increased aggression on the part of China toward the Philippines and towards Japan in the maritime domain, Japan is very concerned about U.S. naval resolve and maritime security. in the Asia Pacific. So he is there to say, hey, we need you, the United States. The United States has been the maritime hegemon in the Pacific since the end of World War II. And Japan, that's worked out very well for Japan, right? And now with China's naval modernization and tremendous expansion, Japan is justifiably nervous and is wondering about US commitment to maritime security in the Asia Pacific.
Because we're seeing this buildup of, I guess you could call it an anti-China alliance. And later we're seeing a first ever trilateral summit involving the US, Japan, and the Philippines. At the White House, it follows recurring standoffs in the South China Sea, including the March 23rd spraying of water by the Chinese Coast Guard to stop the Philippines from supplying a marine station on the Sierra Madre. That's a rusting ship that's been lodged on the Second Thomas Shoal for 25 years. The Second Thomas Shoal is not an island, it's a disputed reef. Both the U.S. and now Japan are ready to back Manila's claims. Here you see on this map the territorial waters claimed by the Philippines. Japan, which plans to double defense spending over the next 5 years. Its forces last Sunday took part in joint exercises in the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. Joint exercises that also included the U.S. and Australian forces. Jean-Yves Collin, to see the Japanese taking part in these kinds of military maneuvers, this is new.
Well, it's new, but not completely new, if I may say, because it all started with the arrival of Shinzo Abe as a prime minister in 2012. And it's important to remember that in the recent years, there were many encounters between the US and Japan. The first successor of Abe, Mr. Suga, came to Washington in April 2021. There was a first visit of Mr. Biden in Tokyo and Seoul in 2022. Mr. Kishida, in order to prepare the G7 summit, went to the US and Europe in the very first months of 2023. And now it's a state visit. And it's important for Japan to have a state visit because it's the first one since 2015 when Shinzo Abe was received. Welcome in
and what
Washington.
A state visit. I mean, again, promised a Japanese astronaut will be going to the moon.
Yes, it's just a kind of gimmick in a way to please maybe the Japanese to make them
But
proud.
more importantly, they're talking about things like air defense. They're talking about all the things that...
They are talking, for instance, about a project on artificial intelligence between Keio University and Carnegie Mellon University, I think. Also between Tsukuba University and another American university with financing coming from Amazon, NVIDIA, and also Microsoft. So there are something very real.
You heard Elizabeth describing how in the United States, people are nervous because this new posture by Japan in the Pacific, it relies on the U.S. taking the lead.
The Japanese themselves are a little bit nervous. In a way, the seeds for the Japanese came from the Vietnam War. When they saw the U.S. retreating from South Vietnam, they started to have a certain fear about the commitment of the U.S. to Japan. Next came the retreat from Afghanistan. And of course, in the backyard is maybe the possibility of Mr. Trump to come back as a president. And that's why they are talking about Japan being a kind of Ukraine of the East. They are afraid about the fact that maybe the Congress, maybe the president, will not support Japan in case of a grave difficulty.
Elizabeth Larousse, your thoughts on that, especially with North Korea testing missiles, the fact that the Japanese have been front and center in their support of Ukraine. How founded are those fears?
I'm sorry, which fears? Fears of?
That the U.S. will disengage from the Pacific.
When we're talking about political, certainly militarily, we're engaged because we have defensive alliances, with each of the major democratic regimes, of course, in the Asia Pacific of South Korea, Philippines, and Japan. And so those date to the 1950s. And so, we are obligated to help defend those places as they are supposed to help, defend us. But when you're talking about like the political equation, yeah, it is quite concerning. Certainly one of the reasons Kishida is here is because he's actually not very popular in Japan right now, and he needs to call elections. I believe he's coming up to like the end of his 3-year term, and so now he has to call elections. And so he's here trying to drum up support back in Japan. But also, in the United States, of course, President Biden wants to have a good foreign policy record for his reelection prospects in November. And so, we could talk about like security alliances and defense and military buildups and budget. But yeah, when you talk about like the politics of the situation, that's actually where what the rubber meets the road is. Is there will actually to participate in any type of military action if the going actually gets tough, let's say against China, in the South China Sea or in the Pacific.
Because we're seeing all these buildup of, certainly talking up things like the AUKUS alliance involving Australia and the United Kingdom, talking about bringing Japan into that. Again, those images we saw of those joint maneuvers that are taking place in Filipino water last Sunday. Elizabeth Larus, how does Japan see itself going forward?
Well, Japan sees itself certainly as a increasingly influential maritime power in the Indo-Pacific. Every year for the last 10 years, Japan has increased its military budget. And as you mentioned, they're going to double it within the next 5 years. Japan is now ranked number 7 out of 145 countries in terms of global firepower. And it has increased over the years. Maybe around 2015, I believe it was ranked about maybe 14 or so. So it's moved up. It's moved up. It's only below the UK in terms of firepower. That is a military, capability. And so Japan definitely sees that it needs to, look out for itself. Of course, it values the relationship with the United States, but as I mentioned, because the political equation is rather concerning, Japan realizes that it needs to increase its own defense capabilities.
A mirror of the conversation, I guess, we're having here in Europe when it comes to NATO. Elizabeth Larus, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Washington. I want to thank Jean-Yves Collin. Thank you for being with us for this abridged edition of the France 24 debate due to a strike by technical staff.